Good afternoon, everybody. I am delighted to welcome you today to our lecture on Christianity, Education and the Colonial Experiences by Dr. Theo Adenusi. Theo is an educator and a teacher with lots of experience as a practicing educator in Nigeria and in Ireland. Theo did a master's degree from 2011 to 2014 in Rudolf Steiner University College in Oslo in Norway. From 2015 to 2019, he was departmental teaching assistant in Mary Immaculate College in Limerick, and he was a PhD student in the university. In 2019, he finished his doctorate with a thesis on education in Western Africa as a contested space between global politics and local cultures, an exploration through critical discourse analysis. Theo has written on the theme of Indigenous educational systems in Western Africa. He has looked at pre-colonial education. He has looked at the paradox of knowledge in the light of Socrates and Fichte. He's interested in philosophy of education, international education, and he teaches philosophy of education in Mary Immaculate College. And we are absolutely delighted to have him today to talk to us on this really interesting topic. Thank you, Theo.
Thank you very much, Trish. Thank you for tuning in. Firstly, just to appreciate the Institute for the opportunity to share my research with you all, and thank you, Trish, for your support through the journey of the PhD itself. I really appreciate all the support and kind words. They meant a lot. Today, my hope this afternoon is to leave you with few questions at the end of this session, as I've been told that my research raised more questions than the answer, and that is the intention. That's what I often say when people say that to me about my research. Now, the topic of our conversation this afternoon is Christianity, Education and the Colonial Experience. These three phenomena we want to look at together, the ethical complexities associated with them in the West African context. But before I actually touch on that, I want to give you a quick overview of the research itself. As Trish mentioned earlier, the title of the research is Education in West Africa as a Contested Space Between Global Politics and Local Cultures. Now, what I intend to do, what I did in this research is to kind of present these two forces, these two contending forces. So I invite you now to imagine that these two contending forces, and education in the region is the space where this contention occurs. To look at global politics in this sense basically refer to global education strategies and policies put out and updated very often by UNESCO, the World Bank, and the UNDP's education goals. So that on one hand, and to look at the conception of indigenous identities in contemporary discourse, to look at that on the other hand, and to then look at these two forces kind of contending with each other within education. So that's what I try to do in this research. Now, my research question is how and in what ways can resentment toward formal schooling in West Africa be informed through critical discourse analysis? So the challenge of resentment toward education is approached in this research as a regional issue. And the argument is to fully understand this challenge of resentment toward formal schooling. I will clarify the term resentment in a minute, but to fully understand this challenge of resentment toward formal schooling, it is important to actually understand the region from an historical perspective, and to understand the significance of these global politics, the one I referred to earlier, the significance that their significance on education in the region. So these are the two kind of things I try to put forward in this research. Now, contextual clarification of resentment itself. I understand that resentment is a very strong term. It's a very strong word. So just to clarify what resentment actually means in the context of this research. So resentment then, in this research, is viewed as a cultural response to perceived domination and imposition of best practices. In a way, a form of pushback against the forces that dominate, the forces that actually impose on the other. So resentment in my research is viewed as that. Further clarification, to classify this term resentment, like I said, I understand that the term resentment is a very strong and forceful term, but I need to clarify it. Now, it's classified here into two forms of resentment. One, I refer to as subtle form of cultural defiance that expressed by certain cultures, certain groups in the region. And this is expressed in part through preventing and limiting education of women, girls, and in some cases, the firstborn male child of in the family due to perceived cultural roles. And the other classification then of resentment in this research is referred to all the violent attacks against educational facilities and educational stakeholders in the region. And the images I put there on the right, these images popped up in international media a few years ago. Unfortunately, these situations, they've been in the area for some time. While these are not widespread across West Africa, the pockets that they actually affect, the pockets that experience these violent attacks, and cultural groups and entities that actually still practice or impose this issue of limiting education of women and girls, they're significant enough to prevent this drive for education, this drive for education for all, for example, this global drive to ensure that everyone have access to education. These challenges, these form of resentment, as they are referred to in this research, they're significant enough that they warrant attention. So this is the classification of the term resentment in this research. Now, the contention addressed in this research is between the various indigenous cultures and knowledge systems in the region and global politics. And like as I've said, education then is the space where this contention occurs or where this contention is prominent. Now, just to give you this classification of this contention going on, first, indigenous cultures and knowledge system. There is often this issue which some of you may have read about, or some of you are familiar with, this gradual but consistent erosion of indigenous traditions and traditional norms, quite evident in many indigenous communities, not only in West Africa, but across Africa and in other places as well. The erosion of indigenous values, local languages, and other aspects of indigenous cultures. Now, these experiences then, they present the need to fight for or protect perceived collective indigenous identity. And I use those few words there to refer to this notion of who we are. And I use the word we purposefully because as an African myself, I count myself as being part of the social context, my research that I'm researching. So this notion of who we are. Now, these challenges that these cultures or indigenous groups and languages and so on experience or are experiencing in contemporary times, they present this need to protect that. So in a way, these challenges then give rise to this form of decolonization argument in contemporary discourse on education. They kind of give rise to this idea of, yes, whatever you're bringing might be great, might be wonderful. This is us, and we need to bring that into play as well. So my work in this research is actually to deconstruct that, to understand that better. On the other hand, global politics. global education policies and strategies being issued by UNESCO, the World Bank, and UNDP's education goals have said, calling and working for the expansion of education. For example, the Education for All franchise by UNESCO. These goals of these global education policies and strategies are underpinned by two key principles: education as a fundamental human right and education as a public good. Now, I try to put this side by side to illustrate the basis for this contention I'm trying to put forward to you, this that I try to put forward in this research. Now, on one hand, you have this drive for global education, education for all. Everyone must have access, should have access to education, which is the right thing to do. And there you have the principles that underpin this drive, this good idea, as I refer to it in parts of the thesis. On the other hand, you have this drive as well to defend, as I've said, who we are, our indigenous identities, our cultural values. We need to defend that. We need to protect that. We need to fight for it. So you have these two things, and they play out within the context of education. And that's the contention I try to illustrate in this research. Now, the discourse trend wherein my research is situated is this constant call, or this ongoing call, for a merger between these two forces contending within the education sphere in the region. The challenges of education, they're not new. And this research as well, the ideas raised in this research, they are not new. But I present this research as being part of that dialogue that's kind of broad discourse going on how to resolve most of this challenge, some of these challenges. So the call has always been, how about if we have two forces contending? A compromise is the best thing to do, as we all know. How about we look for what is good in both and we bring them together and everybody is happy out to create this fantastic, this great thing that we need to, in order to move on and free us from some of these challenges that we face in education across the region. Now, and don't forget, the main challenge that my research is focusing on here is this challenge of resentment towards formal schooling. Now, so in other words, one of the ways to resolve that is to kind of have this merger, this ideological partnership between the two. Now, this then lead me to my conceptual framework for the research. I use this idea of presented by Homi Bhabha, this idea of cultural hybridity and the third space, because here you have contending forces, and the argument often in so many academic texts produced by African, particularly West African academics, the argument is often, let's find the middle ground, let's bring it all together. So that leads me into this, looking at how can we create an hybrid? How can we bring them together? So that leads me to Homi Bhabha. So an aspect of my conceptual framework is this idea of cultural hybridity and the third space, which the third space, the space where Bhabha himself referred to as the distance in between, the meeting point, where things meet and where they overlap, kind of the middle of these two spaces. Now I have three circles and a peg there in this conceptual framework. And if I could explain it very quickly, just in a very simple way to say, on one hand, you have education in West Africa, in the region, and all the challenges and all the issues in there. On the other hand, you have this global drive for education for all, education as human right, now bringing them together. My contribution then to this post-colonial discourse of hybridity and the third space is that for some reason, all the effort put together to bring these two things together, these two contending forces together, they've not worked so far. And my argument is because the ideologies that underpin this contention, by their nature, they're set to actually challenge each other. Meaning, on one hand, you have the decolonization argument. On the other hand, you have the globalization drive, the global move. By nature of decolonization, The intention is to seek to break off from the influence of the other. The nature of globalization is to bring people together. So by the nature of these two ideologies that underpin these two forces, meeting in the middle has been challenging so far. So I argue for an independent third space. And very quickly, the other section or the other aspect of my conceptual framework is the genealogical analysis by Foucault based on Nietzsche's work. That is deconstructing each of these spaces, because my argument is that they're complex spaces themselves. They are not just these entities here that are not that complex. No, they're complex spaces. And in order to create a space to address the challenge going on within these spaces and between them, it is important to understand where the ideas that underpin them come from. Hence, the genealogical analysis, the other part of my conceptual framework. Now, the first aspect, indigenous cultures and knowledge system, what I did there is I did an in-depth historical analysis of the region from the 4th century, 4th century being the establishment of the first great empire in the region, the Ghana Empire, up to the 20th century, the former establishment of the colonies in the region, but the French and the British colonies in the region. So I did an analysis of that. And what I was looking for there is to try to understand this idea of who we are. Are there elements of it there? What does the history of the region say about this thing we hold on to, this collective identity? Now I moved from there to explore the portrayal of pre-colonial indigenous cultures and knowledge systems in fiction texts, particularly the fiction I used, this text here, Things Fall Apart by Chinua Achebe. And I also analyzed an autobiographical text, this one, of Water and Spirit by Malidoma Patrisome. It's a West African shaman, and his experience then of the indigenous culture of his tribe that span across 3 countries in the region. And Chinua Achebe wrote about the Igbo tribe in Nigeria. So to spread it out, I realized that there's a shift towards the decolonization narratives in the way the region, the culture of the region, the knowledge system, the way they're portrayed in literature. There's a shift towards the decolonization narratives. So it's different. There's a huge difference between what the history of the region says and what is portrayed in fiction text and so on. Also then, I analyzed quite a few academic texts written by academics in the region, to explore the conception of pre-colonial indigenous identities and knowledge systems in academic discourse. And what I realized is it links to that portrayal in fiction text and autobiography. It reproduces that decolonization narrative, the decolonization narrative in the region. So the point I'm trying to make there is the notion of pre-colonial indigenous identity, this idea of who we are. Hello? This idea of who we are in contemporary discourse on education is situated within the purposefully constructed decolonization narratives. You know, this, I refer to them in the research as this romantic notion, this romantic view of the past, you know, lit fire on, fire burning under a moonlit night and somebody telling a story, oh, how fantastic is the past. So what I realize is this idea, the narrative that underpin this form of collective indigenous identity that we have, these narratives are situated within the decolonization narratives. And I'll explain a little bit about that in a few slides down. Very quickly, on the other hand then, to deconstruct this global drive, this global idea of education as a fundamental human right, education as a public good, what I did then is to look at educational policies since the 1800s, both in French colonies of West Africa and in French colonies of West Africa, to see the introduction of educational policies and strategies and all the policies that influence education in the region. What I'm trying to look for there, as I kind of have the map there, is to look for this idea of education as a fundamental human right. it didn't just appear as an epiphany when the team or the group or whoever put in these fundamental human rights together in 1948. This idea of education for all, education as a fundamental human right, didn't just appear then. It has been in the works for a long time. In these colonies in the region, the idea of education as a tool for colonizers, an effective tool for colonizing the native, has been there since the 1800s. In the 1900s, it became stronger. This idea of, okay, in order to get a grip of the region, education is a key to achieve that. So I then kind of make an argument that the arrival of education as a fundamental human right in 1948, which underpins all the global policies that has come between now and then, up till now, it didn't just appear there, it has colonial root. And what am I trying to do in deconstructing these two sides? And here is what I'm trying to achieve. So very quickly, on one hand, in the name of decolonization, I kind of refer to it in that way. The hegemonic romantic notion of pre-colonial indigenous cultures and knowledge system, that's this notion of who we are in contemporary discourse on education, legitimizes cultural response that challenge perceived domination and imposition. So this form of resentment. And as I've classified them at the beginning, limiting or preventing the education of women and girls, for example, violent attack by Boko Haram and other terrorist organizations there, to push back against this force that dominates in a way, that erodes the culture in the region and so on. And what am I trying to show there? I'm trying to show these two, the form of power at play within these two contending forces. On the one hand, you have the force that dominates, which I'll get to in a minute. On the other hand, you have the force that resists that dominance. Now, within that, my argument is it engenders its own injustices and a form of power there that goes on within that. Now, someone like me who challenged this contemporary notion of, oh, look, I mean, this notion of the past in contemporary discourse, look how great things were before things fell apart and so on and so forth. I'm almost considered as an outsider who challenges, who trivializes this ethnic politics and this argument that goes on in the region. And I want to highlight that in the process of fighting against oppression, in this context, it engenders its own injustices within that. On the other hand, in the name of globalization, while principles such as fundamental human right and as a public good, the basis of education for all and other global education policies and strategies are noble and well-intentioned in the 21st century West Africa, they are rooted in an ideology which considered education as an effort, as an effective tool for the colonization of the natives. Now, while this is further obscured in this era of global cultural sensitivity, the impact of education on indigenous cultures and communities remains significant. So I'm trying to highlight here the errors, if you like, the fabrications built into these two contending forces. And the conclusion that I try to draw from highlighting this challenge is this, which in part my contribution as well to this broad conversation, the discourse on resolving some of these challenges facing education in the region. Now, the goal in this research is to highlight the fabrication and the essence, the fabrication in the essence of both decolonization narratives and the noble, well-intended principles of education as a fundamental human right and as a public good, and the obscure ethical implications and injustices they impose. Now, my argument here is bringing such critical understanding to bear in a dialogic relation between global politics and local cultures in a third space, in an independent third space, with the understanding that meeting in the middle might not be a great option because of these two contending ideologies. So bringing this understanding of the errors that much of the side the life carries into that third space can play an important role in resolving the challenge of resentment toward formal schooling. In a way, I'm trying to say, until these forces understand the errors built into them, compromise might be something far out there. But the minute we start understanding that, okay, whatever it is we hold so dear, there are errors built into them, that room for compromise might occur. And that's the main point I try to make through this research. Now, going back to the topic of our conversation this afternoon, the questions I said I want to leave you with, I want to tie it into the research itself. Christianity to begin with. The question here is, how can one balance the Christian's divine obligation to spread the gospel and the realities of salvation and conversion of the natives on indigenous traditions and ideas and identities? What am I trying to say here? A concept like education for all, education as a fundamental human right. Of course, education should be for all. It should be a right that everyone should have access to. However, the question is, can an idea be so good that it has no ethical implications? Or is there a line at some point for the fact that something is good, well-intended, and great? Where is the line? At what point can a very good idea cross an ethical line? Education, as it relates to the research and the talk this afternoon, philosophically, it can be argued that the process of education resulting in new knowledge and the transformation of the educated occasions and ontological violence. And Sharon told the Maynooth did a lot of work on that, looking at education, the violence that education engenders in a way, this process of transformation and bringing about change. So the question is, the ethical question, that the idea for global, this global drive for education for all, the question, the ethical question it raises is, whose education for all? Where's the place of local languages? And this issue of relegation of indigenous identities. Now, lastly, the colonial experience. The point I try to make here is this: reproducing this notion, this fantastic notion of the past in contemporary discourse, the unintended consequences of that, because you see this in literatures, in academic texts, in several arguments. It kind of produces this idea of things were great before they came along, and there you go. Now, my challenge is the place of that argument in contemporary discourse. Yes, the decolonization narratives were necessary, they were needed at the point, at that time. But once the region was free, once the countries were free, independent states, we went back to our bickering and conflict and all the fights, but the narrative stuck. And now that narrative then formed the basis of challenging perceived domination. So my argument here is there's error in that. That needs to be deconstructed, because that is kind of a utopia we set up. And then we bounce that against this force that we feel dominates. And at the end of the day, it's just, and organizations such as terrorist organizations and so on are using these narratives, this argument, to justify the injustices they perpetrate. So, and this is the point I try to make here in this research. Thank you. That's all I have.
Well, Tayo, thank you so much. You've given us quite enough to think about and to talk about. And can I welcome people who joined us, and I think they found it quite difficult to get in, and there are some people trying to get in as we speak. So for those of you who missed Tayo's presentation, I think we will have it recorded and we will put it up online on YouTube. But I suppose what struck me as being particularly of interest, Tayo, when you were talking, was this kind of romanticized version of the past, which justifies a particular ideology And that when you deconstruct that and when you resist that, then you find that resentment is forced in your direction, probably from both sides, from the globalized side, you know, and from the indigenous side. So just, you know, I know you were talking about a third space, but just, you know, if you could tell me, is that an accurate assumption that it is a very contentious space to be in? It's far easier to be on the side of the globalized or the indigenous, but not, you know, at that interface to deconstruct both and move beyond them.
Yes, thank you very much, Trish. Yes, I think achieving this third space is a challenge itself. And that's kind of where I left the research, where I kind of left it open, of course, for the research as well as bringing about this conversation that what will that third space look like? In a way, I think because of the era we lived in as well, we live in currently as well, oftentimes we hold so tight to whatever it is we, whatever it is we believe in, what we agree on, and stuff like that. And then anything that is outside of that, maybe it's not right, or it's the other thing. So we push such a thing away. So within that kind of context, the third space one might not be in a position to achieve that, but to achieve this third space, this new idea, a new political initiative, as Baba puts it, one needs to start understanding that this thing I hold so dear, this idea, however good it may seem or sound, what could be in there that makes the other person to push against it? It brings about understanding. Until one understands the other person's position, I feel negotiation is far off. And that's the point I'm trying to make here, that this third space should be a space whereby education for all, education as a fundamental human right, who could be against that? What could be wrong with that? But hang on a minute, whoever is pushing against that, why? Genuinely to ask that question. Also on the other side, to push against that, whatever underpins that, if you say this is who I am and whatever it is you're bringing is against that, to question that. Where did this idea of who we are, where did it come from? How did we get to this point? What could be in there that is not seen, this new thing or this thing that the other person is bringing? And this is the point. So the third space itself, it's a space that I think we all should work in together with fresh mind. I don't know if this answers your question.
Trish. No, I think I get that, the complexity of it and I suppose the challenge of it, the tensions that are in that space, not a comfortable space. No. You know, does anybody have a question? Any of our participants have a question? I was struck in particular by just one thing that you said about transformative learning or transformative education, and the desire to transform the learner does ontological violence. I think you quoted Sharon Todd there.
That's right.
That's right. Particularly interesting as educators, because I think as educators our aim is always to challenge and to try and transform, and we talk about transformative education all the time. So I'm particularly interested in terms of very well-meaning, perhaps missionary education that was inspired by Christianity and deep religious commitment and a desire for the salvation of peoples and the betterments of their lives. I'm going to ask you a question now. So what could be wrong with that? What could be wrong with that?
Yeah, I'm so glad you raised that question. And that's the question I would like to leave us with as well. What could be wrong with that? Personally, as a Christian myself, raised that way, I still, as a part of me as well, because of my traditional upbringing as well, still holding on to these cultural traditions, these things that we believe in. Now, if just to make it a little bit personal as well, I know in my family, my father would be that, hold on to this tradition and believe. He was baptized a Christian, so he's baptized a Christian. And the mom would want to go to church, and all this traditional stuff, they're sin now. So where do we put these things? This idea of, salvation of the others, to save the soul of the natives, to better their lives and all that. To a certain degree, that raised ethical questions as well.
Yeah.
As one could connect it to this transformation that education brings. It's usually not a smooth process. Now, the ethical implication that carries, being aware of that. So if we have the opportunity then, say, to go into a community, oh, this community is in need. Okay, let's go there. Maybe they're in need of salvation, as the missionaries did in the past, or they're in need of this thing or that thing, whatever it is. Do we go in there and provide what we think they need? Or do we engage with the community to say, what do you need? And that brings in Nordens and the rest, and philosophers, making such argument about care and support and all that kind of stuff. So these are the questions I hope to raise for us to see together, things that we may just, we might overlook, because whatever it is that we bring is so good, is so great, that we might not be able to see from the other person's perspective. Am I rambling, or is that touching on the question?
No, I think these are big issues. About, I mean, they touch on the nature of truth, whether there is universal truth. They touch on the nature of learning. They touch on the nature of religious belief, because I think in terms of missionary movement now, the kind of missionary engagement that people had in the past, which tended to emphasize a fracture with whatever the cultures or spiritual traditions, and an undervaluing of them. I don't think that's in vogue any longer, in so many Christian traditions and communities. And it's about supporting and engaging and dialoguing with people in a respectful way. But, I think there's a kind of there are hard issues that we have to ask ourselves about conversions occurring, at the point of the sword or the point of the gun, or kind of inducements that were given to people, the kind of belittling and underappreciation of and suppression of their cultures. I think they're big issues. I have somebody who wants to ask you a question on video, okay, because he's lost his connection. He's here.
Okay.
Hey, Teo, it's John.
Hello.
How are you?
All right.
Teo, listen, I was listening to you on my phone, but my phone went dead. I'm nearly going to give you a little job, Teo. I thought that was a brilliant presentation.
Thank you very much.
And I teach a master's module on post-colonial theory and literature in Mary I. So I'd hope maybe next semester you'll give me a guest lecture. I
would be delighted to do that. Thank you.
I thought it was an excellent presentation. It was articulate. It was to the point. And I thought, one point you made particularly struck me was the relevance to the notion of the pre-colonial identity is such an Irish obsession as well. That when you look at the Celtic revival in Ireland in the late 19th century, we were harping back to the time of Cú Chulainn and the Red Hand warriors, and this notion of an independent Celtic spirit that existed pre-colonization. And in an African context, do you see that also as an issue, this notion of the imagined community of the pre-colonial period?
Yes.
Which becomes the kind of rationale for independence. It becomes the bedrock of all independence movements, is this imaginary and as you rightly point out, romanticized time.
Absolutely, and that's the point I try to. Thank you very much for your question. That's the point I try to raise there in the research. That now, I have nothing against the decolonization narrative, this constructed idea of what was. At the time, considering the level of diversity and the level of the complex nature of West Africa itself. Now, in this talk, it may sound as if I try to present West Africa as a unified entity, but it's a complex, deeply diverse region, and a lot of issues going on there. And one could only see that through that historical analysis, across centuries. Now, but this idea of we need to be free from the other, this constructed narrative of the past helped to achieve that. It brought the people together. So I found that these ideas, they were necessary when they were, when they came to light, when we start reading about them in text and so on and so forth. But my contention there is, once the other left, once the region became, self-government and all the rest of it, that narrative stuck, and we went back to our bickering and so on and so forth. And now that narrative then became the basis for this collective identity to keep fighting against the other, to assert who we are. So I felt the error in that is significant, because that is often invoked once domination or control or neocolonialism is perceived. And invoking that raised its own issues, because it reproduced so many times that even in academic text, when researchers refer to pre-colonial times, is this flowery and fantastic time. So we lost that idea of, that the ruggedness in that history that we have. And then we have this sanitized version. We use that as a basis to confront this perceived domination and so on and so forth. And then it blinds us to see, to see new things, if you like. And I know I'm kind of generalizing, and which is what I tried to highlight at the beginning, that limiting education of women and girls, it doesn't happen in some big cities, but it still happens. Well, you see, burning down schools and kidnapping and so on, it doesn't happen across the region, but it happens in enough places that it warrants trying to say, why are people doing this? This notion of fighting for who we are, our identity, what is that? And until we start understanding that, I don't know if that answers your question.
Joe, it absolutely does. And if you look at the history of post-colonial nations, very often a civil war follows very shortly after the colonizer has left, because, as you rightly point out, when the other is gone, we need an internal other. We need someone who doesn't represent what we feel our national identity represents. So they then become the target, which does prove your point. But Theo, listen, I'm not going to hog it, but that was a brilliant presentation. I really enjoyed it. And I'm definitely going to get you to do something for me in Mary I, 100%.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Okay. Do we have any other comments or any other questions?
Oh, Theo, if I might, it's Catherine Lang speaking. Trish, if I can follow up, John preempted me. Theo, I also teach in the department, and was very fascinated by your talk. And unfortunately, I had terrible troubles getting into the talk, so I missed the first 15 or 20 minutes. But I actually teach Adichie's Purple Hibiscus and Dangaremba Nervous Condition. So I'm very interested in what you were talking about, colonial education.
Catherine, I can't really hear you.
Oh, sorry.
I hear you, yeah.
Can you hear me? Oh, thank you. So first of all, when you're coming to Mary I to teach for John, I would love you to come and talk to my class on Adichie as well. And second, your thoughts about, I'm coming from a literature angle, about writing about education, Christian education, such as Adichie's. I know you mentioned Achebe as well. Do you have further thoughts on those, the ways in which writers like Adichie have engaged with this subject?
It's part of the. These are groups of writers and thinkers and all that. I hope my work get to at some point, to challenge this notion of, which was the reason why I kind of chose Achebe's work, Things Fall Apart. It presents this, there's no way one reads this story and one doesn't feel, oh my God, things really did fall apart, and we really need to, get things going. And that then set the basis, set the foundation for this argument that we keep having and this discussion that we want when we refer to the past. So this sanitized notion of, in the old times, there's the education. Yes, the indigenous education system or the indigenous knowledge system, the beautiful things about it, the spiritual nature of it, how that connects to the land, how it connects to the people's culture, the cultural norms, and so on and so forth. But there are significant challenges that went with it as well. But often, like I used recall as my theoretical foundation, this thing of memory, what we write out of history and what we bring in, collective forgetfulness and collective remembering, the way literatures actually help to perpetuate that. Because once it's written in story and all that, it becomes a form of echo chamber. So we end up repeating almost the same thing in a way within the same circle. And I was surprised, Chinua Achebe, a fiction text. And what I was looking for there was, how was the past portrayed in here? The text was written in 1958 in the middle of the decolonization struggle itself. Now, I took another text, the autobiography of the African shaman, written in 1994, to compare to see, is there any similarities between the two? One is a fiction, the other one is an autobiography. It was unbelievable how similar the thing is, like they copied off each other. So I thought, is this the situation of the audience we're writing for, or the notion becomes written in our minds, in our thoughts, that to think about the past is to have this image of moonlight and fire and story and all the dance and all the kumbaya and stuff. But it wasn't that sanitized. I don't know if that answered the question.
Thank you. It's fascinating, and there's much to think about and talk further. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thanks for the question.
Just one final question, if anybody has one. No? Theo, you left us with lots to think about and lots of questions. And on the basis of your presentation today, I think we'll be hearing lots more from you in the future. So we wish you well, and we thank you for presenting your really important research to us. And we look forward to hearing from you in the future. Okay, so goodbye, everyone. Thank you for linking in with us, and keep in touch. All of